There's a recipe my grandmother made that doesn't exist anymore. Not in cookbooks, not online, nowhere. She called it mock chicken legs, and it wasn't chicken at all. It was ground meat, shaped by hand, fried until golden, and served on a Sunday like it was something special, and you know what? It was. Because back then, making something out of nothing wasn't just cooking. It was survival. It was hope. It was love wrapped in flour and lard. The 1900s weren't like today. There was no grocery store on every corner, no freezers, no instant anything. People cooked with what they had, and what they had wasn't much. But somehow they made magic. They turned crackers into apple pie. They turned potatoes into candy. They turned poverty into feasts that people still remember 100 years later. And now, most of those recipes are gone, forgotten, buried under decades of convenience and progress. But what if we brought them back? What if we stepped into the new year with the same creativity, the same grit, the same heart that fed entire families through the hardest times in American history? That's what this is about. 30 recipes that time forgot. 30 dishes that deserve to come home. 1. Mock chicken legs. Let's start with the one that started it all for me. Mock chicken legs. You take ground beef or pork, whatever's cheap. You mix it with breadcrumbs, a little onion, salt, pepper. Then you shape it around a wooden skewer or a clean stick so it looks like a drumstick. You roll it in flour. You fry it in hot lard until the outside turns crispy and brown, and when you pull it out of that pan, it looks like chicken. It smells like chicken, but it's not. This was Depression-era brilliance. Chicken was expensive. Ground meat was not. But families still wanted something that felt special, something that looked like a Sunday dinner. So they created it. They shaped hope with their hands. And when kids saw those golden drumsticks on the table, they didn't care that it wasn't real chicken. It tasted like love. It tasted like their mom trying. And that was enough. Mock chicken legs weren't about lying. They were about making do, about refusing to let hard times steal the joy from a family meal. You can still make these today. They're rich. They're hearty. They're a reminder that sometimes the best things aren't real at all. They're just made with care. People don't cook like this anymore. But maybe they should, because there's something powerful about taking the cheapest ingredients and turning them into something worth remembering. The meat stays juicy inside that crispy crust. The wooden stick makes it fun for kids to hold, and when you bite into one, you're not just tasting ground beef. You're tasting ingenuity. You're tasting a family's refusal to give up on joy even when money ran out. 2. Spanish rice. Spanish rice wasn't Spanish. It was American through and through. But somewhere along the line, someone decided that rice cooked with tomatoes and onions needed a fancy name. So Spanish rice it was, and it showed up everywhere. Military canteens, church basements, school cafeterias, boarding houses, anywhere people needed to stretch a meal. You start with white rice. You cook it in lard or bacon grease until it starts to brown just a little. Then you add chopped onions. Let them soften. Pour in canned tomatoes or tomato sauce. Add water, a little salt, maybe a pinch of pepper if you're feeling bold. Then you cover it and let it steam until the rice is tender and tinted red. It's simple, almost too simple. But that's the point. This was food for the masses, food that filled bellies without emptying wallets. And it worked. Spanish rice became so common that people forgot it was ever special. It just was. It existed. It fed people. And that was enough. But here's the thing. When you make it today, with real lard, with fresh onions, with good tomatoes, it tastes different than you remember. It tastes like comfort, like a warm room on a cold night, like a meal that doesn't ask for much but gives everything it has. Spanish rice is the backbone of American canteen cooking. It's the dish that kept soldiers fed, kids full, and families together. And it deserves to come back. The rice absorbs all that tomato flavor and turns a beautiful rusty red. Each grain is separate but tender, and when you scoop it onto a plate next to beans or a piece of cornbread, you've got a meal that cost pennies but feels like a feast. This is the kind of dish that made people feel taken care of, even when times were hard. 3. Prune and apricot stew. Now this one's going to surprise you. Prune and apricot stew sounds like dessert. It's not. Well, not always. Back in the early 1900s, dried fruit was cheaper than fresh. It lasted longer, and it could be turned into a full meal if you knew what you were doing. You take dried prunes and dried apricots, you soak them in water until they plump up. Then you simmer them slow with a little sugar, maybe some cinnamon, a squeeze of lemon if you have it. You let it cook down until the fruit is soft and the liquid turns into a thick, sweet syrup. And then you serve it, sometimes over rice, sometimes with bread, sometimes just in a bowl by itself. It was eaten as supper, not breakfast, not dessert, supper. Because when meat was too expensive and vegetables were out of season, dried fruit stew was what you had, and families didn't complain. They ate it. They were grateful for it, because it was sweet, it was filling, and it was there. This dish is a time capsule. It's a window into a world where fruit wasn't just a snack, it was survival. And the people who made it didn't need fancy ingredients or complicated techniques. They just needed patience and a pot. Try making prune and apricot stew today. Serve it warm over rice or with a piece of buttered bread, and taste what it was like to live in a time when sweetness was rare and precious. The fruit gets so soft it almost melts on your tongue. The syrup is dark and rich with hints of spice and citrus, and when you eat it, you realize that dessert and dinner weren't always separate things. Sometimes they were the same. Sometimes sweetness was survival. And families learned to be grateful for both. But we're just getting started, because the next recipe takes something as simple as corn and turns it into something people used to line up for. 4. Corn oysters. Corn oysters. The name alone makes you curious, doesn't it? They're not oysters. They're not from the sea. They're just corn. But somehow, when you fry them up in a hot pan, they puff and crisp and turn golden in a way that reminded people of fried oysters. So the name stuck. You scrape fresh corn off the cob. You mix it with a little flour and egg, salt and pepper. You drop spoonfuls of that batter into sizzling lard or butter, and you fry them until they're crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. That's it. That's the whole recipe. But the result? Pure magic. Corn oysters were everywhere before refrigeration, because fresh corn didn't last. You had to use it fast, and this was one of the best ways to do it. They were served at church suppers, family dinners, community gatherings, and people loved them because they were crispy, they were sweet, they were something special made from something ordinary. The beauty of corn oysters is in their simplicity. No fancy equipment, no long ingredient list, just corn, batter, and heat. And yet, they taste like summer, like childhood, like a time when food didn't need to be complicated to be good. You can still make these today. Use fresh corn if you can get it, or frozen if that's what you have. Either way, they'll taste like history, like a warm kitchen, like a recipe that shouldn't have been forgotten. The edges get lacy and brown, while the center stays tender and bursting with corn flavor. Kids love them because they're finger food. Adults love them because they taste like their grandmother's kitchen, and everyone goes back for more because once you start eating corn oysters, it's hard to stop. 5. Baked stuffed onions. Onions weren't just seasoning back then, they were the main event, and baked stuffed onions prove it. You take big yellow onions, you peel them, you hollow out the centers, and then you fill them with a mixture of breadcrumbs, butter, herbs, and sometimes a little leftover meat if you had it. You place them in a baking dish. You pour a little water or broth around them so they don't dry out, and you bake them slow until the onions turn soft and sweet and the stuffing turns golden brown on top. This was elegant poverty cooking. It looked fancy, it felt fancy, but it cost almost nothing. Onions were cheap, breadcrumbs were made from stale bread, butter was stretched thin, And yet, when you served these at the dinner table, people felt like they were eating something special. Baked stuffed onions were popular in boarding houses and working-class homes across America. They were filling, they were flavorful. And they proved that you didn't need expensive ingredients to make something beautiful. The sweetness of the baked onion, the crunch of the stuffing, the way it all melts together into something warm and comforting. That's what this dish is about, and it's a shame more people don't make it anymore. When you cut into a baked stuffed onion, the layers separate like petals. The onion itself becomes tender and almost creamy. The stuffing on top provides texture and richness, and the whole thing tastes like someone put real effort into making dinner special, even when there wasn't much money to work with. Because sometimes the simplest ingredients, treated with care, create the most memorable meals. 6. Mock apple pie. Here's where things get really interesting. Mock apple pie. No apples, just crackers. And somehow it tastes like apple pie. I know, it sounds impossible, but it's real. And it's been around since the 1800s. You take Ritz crackers or soda crackers, you break them up and layer them in a pie crust. Then you make a syrup with water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice. You pour that syrup over the crackers. You dot it with butter. You add cinnamon. You cover it with a top crust. And you bake it. And here's the miracle. When you bite into it, the crackers soften and take on the texture of cooked apples. The syrup tastes tart and sweet like apple filling. The cinnamon ties it all together. And, unless someone tells you, you might not even know there are no apples in it. This recipe became famous during the Depression. Apples were seasonal, expensive, hard to keep. But crackers? Crackers were cheap. Crackers were everywhere. And someone, somewhere, figured out that if you cooked them just right, you could trick your brain into tasting apple pie. Mock apple pie isn't about deception. It's about creativity. It's about refusing to go without. It's about making dessert when dessert seemed impossible. And that's beautiful. The cream of tartar is the secret. It gives the syrup that tart bite that makes you think of green apples. The crackers break down just enough to feel like fruit. And when you serve it warm with a scoop of vanilla ice cream, people will swear they're eating the real thing. This pie was printed on Ritz cracker boxes for decades. Families made it for holidays when fruit was out of reach, and kids grew up never knowing they'd been eating crackers for dessert. Try it for yourself. Bake a mock apple pie and see if you can tell the difference. You might be surprised. You might be amazed. And you might realize that sometimes the fake version is just as good as the real thing. 7. Rice pudding with orange peel. Rice pudding was everywhere in the 1900s. Boarding houses, diners, home kitchens. It was cheap, it was filling, and it could be flavored 100 different ways. But the best version? The one with orange peel. You cook white rice in milk with a little sugar. You add strips of fresh orange peel while it simmers so the citrus oil infuses into the pudding. You stir it slow and low until the rice is soft and the milk thickens into something creamy and sweet. Then you fish out the orange peel. You spoon the pudding into bowls, and you serve it warm or cold. The orange peel makes all the difference. It adds brightness, freshness, a little zing that cuts through the richness of the milk. And back then, when citrus was a luxury, that little touch of orange made rice pudding feel fancy. It made it feel special. Rice pudding with orange peel was comfort food for people who didn't have much. It was dessert for families who couldn't afford cake. It was sweetness in a world that was often bitter. And it worked. This is the kind of recipe that makes you slow down, that makes you stir the pot and watch the rice soften, that makes you appreciate the small things, like the smell of orange, the warmth of milk, the simplicity of something homemade. The orange oil from the peel turns the whole pudding faintly fragrant. It's subtle but unmistakable, and when you take a spoonful, you get that perfect combination of creamy rice and bright citrus. This was the kind of dessert that boarding house cooks made in big batches. It was cheap enough to feed a crowd, sweet enough to make people happy, and simple enough that even the busiest cook could make it without breaking a sweat. And that's a feeling worth bringing back. But hold on, because the next one is going to test your courage. It's not for everyone, but for the people who knew how to cook it, it was a treasure. 8. Beef heart stew. Beef heart. Just reading those words makes some people uncomfortable, but back in the 1900s, organ meat wasn't weird. It was normal, it was cheap, and if you cooked it right, it was delicious. Beef heart is a muscle. It's lean, it's tough. But when you slice it thin and stew it slow with onions, carrots, potatoes, and broth, it becomes tender. It becomes rich. It becomes a meal that sticks to your ribs and keeps you full for hours. You brown the sliced heart in a little fat. You add your vegetables. You pour in water or stock. You season it with salt, pepper, maybe a bay leaf. And then you let it simmer, low and slow, for hours, until the meat falls apart and the broth turns dark and flavorful. This was working-class food. This was food for people who couldn't afford prime cuts. But it wasn't second-rate. It was honest. It was nourishing. And it tasted like home. Beef heart stew is a reminder that our ancestors didn't waste anything. They used every part of the animal. They honored the sacrifice, and they made something good out of it. The heart has a deep, beefy flavor that's stronger than regular stew meat. It's not gamey. It's not strange. It's just intense. And when you cook it long enough, it becomes so tender you can cut it with a fork. The vegetables soak up all that rich flavor. The broth becomes something you want to sop up with bread, and the whole pot fills your kitchen with a smell that says, someone's cooking something real. You won't find beef heart at most grocery stores today. You'll have to ask a butcher. But if you can get it, try making this stew. Taste what people ate when times were hard. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why they didn't complain. 9. Creamed turnips. Turnips have a bad reputation. People think they're bitter, boring, something you feed to livestock. But that's because most people don't know how to cook them. Back in the 1900s they did, and creamed turnips were proof. You peel and cube turnips. You boil them until they're soft. Then you drain them and mash them up, just like you would with potatoes. You stir in butter, milk, salt, and pepper. You keep stirring until everything blends together into something smooth and creamy and almost sweet. Turnips, when cooked right, lose their bitterness. They become mild, earthy, comforting, and when you add butter and milk, they turn into something that tastes like a hug, like something your grandmother would make on a cold night. Creamed turnips were served as a side dish in homes all across America. They were cheap. They grew well in poor soil. They lasted through the winter. And they filled bellies when there wasn't much else to eat. This is humble food. But humble doesn't mean bad. It just means honest, real, made with care. The key is to mash them until they're really smooth. No lumps, no chunks. Just creamy, buttery goodness. The turnips have a slightly sweet, slightly peppery flavor that's completely different from potatoes. And when you add enough butter and milk, they become something rich and satisfying. This was winter food, root cellar food, the kind of dish that used what was stored away when the ground was frozen and nothing fresh was available. If you've never tried turnips this way, give it a chance. You might be surprised. You might even like them. And you'll definitely understand why families kept making them year after year, generation after generation. 10. Egg butter spread. Egg butter spread sounds strange, but it was a staple in working-class kitchens. You take hard-boiled eggs, you peel them, you mash them up with softened butter, a little salt, maybe a pinch of pepper, and you whip it all together until it's smooth and creamy. Then you spread it on bread, thick, generous, and you eat it. That's it. That's the whole recipe. But the result is something rich and satisfying, something that turns plain bread into a meal, something that stretches eggs and butter further than they should go. Egg butter spread was popular in Scandinavian immigrant communities, but it spread across America as people discovered how good it was, how easy it was, how filling it was. You could make it in the morning and keep it in the icebox. You could pack it in a lunch pail. You could serve it to kids after school. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was good, it was simple, and it worked. The eggs give it body and protein, the butter makes it rich and spreadable, and the salt brings out all the flavors. Some families added a little mustard or chopped herbs, others kept it plain. Either way, it was a way to make eggs last, to turn two simple ingredients into something that could feed a family for days. This was lunch pail food, school lunch food, the kind of thing that traveled well and didn't need to be kept cold. Try making egg butter spread today. Use good eggs. Use real butter. Spread it on thick slices of homemade bread or toast, and taste what people ate when they needed something more than just bread, but couldn't afford much else. This is food that fills the gaps, food that makes you grateful for the small things, food that reminds you that sometimes less is more. And speaking of simple things made special, the next recipe is going to take you straight back to a southern kitchen. 11. Cornmeal spoon bread. Spoon bread isn't bread. Not really. It's more like a pudding, or a custard, or something in between. But whatever it is, it's delicious, and it was a main dish in southern homes for generations. You mix cornmeal with milk, eggs, butter, and a little salt. You beat it until it's smooth. Then you pour it into a baking dish and bake it until it puffs up and turns golden on top. When it comes out of the oven, it's soft, creamy, almost soufflé-like, and you serve it with a spoon right from the dish. Spoon bread was eaten as a main course, with greens, with beans, with whatever else was on the table. It was filling, it was cheap, and it was comforting in a way that only cornmeal can be. The beauty of spoon bread is in its texture. It's not dense like cornbread. It's light, airy. It melts in your mouth, and the flavor is pure corn, with just enough butter and salt to make it sing. This is Southern soul food at its simplest. No meat, no fancy ingredients, just cornmeal, milk, and eggs turned into something that feels like home, like Sunday supper. Like a recipe passed down from your great-grandmother. The top gets slightly crispy and golden while the inside stays soft and custardy. You scoop it out with a big spoon, and it falls onto your plate in soft, steaming mounds. It soaks up pot liquor from greens. It balances out the richness of fried foods, and it fills you up without weighing you down. Spoon bread deserves to come back, because it's proof that you don't need complexity to create comfort. You just need good ingredients and a little heat. 12. Stewed celery with milk. Celery as the main dish. That's what stewed celery with milk is. And yes, people really did eat it. And yes, they really did like it. You take celery stalks. You cut them into pieces. You simmer them in milk with butter, salt, and pepper until the celery is soft and the milk thickens slightly. Then you serve it, hot, in bowls. Like it's the most important thing on the table. Celery was treated differently back then. It wasn't just a crunchy addition to soup. It was a vegetable, a featured vegetable, and when cooked in milk and butter, it becomes sweet, tender, almost creamy. Stewed celery with milk was popular in boarding houses and working-class homes. It was cheap, it was easy, and it was one more way to put something warm and filling on the table when money was tight. This dish is a reminder that our ancestors saw potential in everything. They didn't waste. They didn't dismiss. They cooked with what they had and made it work. And sometimes what they made was better than anyone expected. The celery loses all its stringiness when cooked this long. It becomes silky and mild. The milk takes on a subtle celery flavor that's comforting and gentle, and the butter ties it all together into something that feels nourishing. This was invalid food, sick room food, the kind of thing you'd make for someone who needed something easy to digest but still needed to eat. Try stewing celery in milk. Taste it. And ask yourself why we stopped treating vegetables like this, why we stopped giving them the attention they deserve, why we forgot that even the simplest ingredients can shine when cooked with care. 13th, mock hollandaise. Real hollandaise sauce is fancy. It's made with egg yolks and butter and lemon juice. It's delicate, it's rich, and it's expensive. But mock hollandaise? That's for the rest of us. You make a roux with flour and butter. You add milk slowly, stirring constantly, until it thickens into a smooth sauce. Then you add a squeeze of lemon juice, a little salt, and maybe a pinch of white pepper. And that's it. You've got a creamy, tangy sauce that tastes almost like the real thing. Mock hollandaise was served over vegetables, over fish, over toast. Anywhere you wanted something rich and flavorful without spending a fortune. It was a way to make simple food feel special, to dress up boiled potatoes or steamed asparagus, to turn an ordinary meal into something worth remembering. This is another example of Depression-era ingenuity. When eggs were too expensive or too precious to use for sauce, people found another way. They adapted, they improvised, and they created something that worked just as well. Mock hollandaise isn't about cutting corners, it's about making do. And sometimes making do leads to something just as good as the original. The flour gives it body. The milk makes it creamy. The lemon juice adds that bright, tangy note that hollandaise is known for. And the whole thing comes together in minutes with ingredients that cost pennies. You can make this sauce thicker or thinner depending on what you're serving it with. You can add herbs if you want. You can spoon it over anything that needs a little richness and elegance. Try it over steamed broccoli or baked fish. Taste how a simple flour sauce can transform a meal. And remember that fancy doesn't always mean better, because sometimes the mock version is the one that lasts. 14. Potato candy. Here's one that sounds impossible. Candy made from mashed potatoes. But it's real. And it's been made in American kitchens for over 100 years. You take leftover mashed potatoes, not many, just a few tablespoons. You mix them with powdered sugar until it forms a stiff dough. Then you roll it out flat. You spread peanut butter over it. You roll it up like a jelly roll. You slice it into little rounds. And you've got candy. The potatoes don't taste like potatoes. They just add moisture and texture. They help the powdered sugar hold together without eggs or butter. And the result is something sweet and peanut buttery and strangely addictive. Potato candy was made during the Depression when sugar was cheaper than other candy ingredients. It was made during the holidays when families wanted something sweet but couldn't afford store-bought treats. And it was made by grandmothers who knew how to turn leftovers into magic. This candy is a time capsule. It's a taste of resourcefulness, of creativity, of people who refuse to let hard times steal their sweetness. The texture is smooth and fudge-like. The peanut butter adds richness and protein, and when you bite into a slice, you get that perfect combination of sweet and salty. Kids loved this candy because it was something homemade and special. Parents loved it because it cost almost nothing to make. And everyone was amazed that something so good could come from leftover mashed potatoes. Make potato candy for your family this new year. Watch their faces when you tell them it's made from mashed potatoes, and then watch them reach for seconds. Because good food doesn't care where it comes from. It just cares that it's made with love. But we're only halfway through. And the next recipe is going to take you back to the simplest, purest form of comfort food. 15. Baked custard cups. Baked custard cups are so simple it almost feels like cheating. But back in the 1900s, this was dessert. This was what you made when you wanted something sweet but didn't have time or money for pie. You whisk together eggs, milk, sugar, and vanilla. You pour the mixture into small cups or ramekins. You place them in a pan of hot water, and you bake them slow and low until the custard sets. When they come out of the oven, they're smooth, silky, just a little wobbly in the center. You can eat them warm or cold. You can dust them with nutmeg or cinnamon. You can serve them plain. Baked custard cups were everywhere, in boarding houses, in school cafeterias, in home kitchens across America, because they were cheap, easy, and they tasted like comfort. The beauty of custard is in its simplicity. It's just eggs and milk and sugar. But when you bake it right, it becomes something more, something gentle, something that feels like a grandmother's hug, like a quiet evening, like a sweet ending to a hard day. The water bath is important. It keeps the custard from curdling. It makes the texture smooth and silky instead of rubbery. And when you tap the side of the cup and the custard jiggles just a little, you know it's perfect. This was dessert that didn't try to impress, it just tried to be good. And it succeeded. This is dessert at its most humble, and its most honest. No frosting, no decoration, no fuss, just pure, simple sweetness. Make baked custard cups for your family. Serve them warm with a sprinkle of nutmeg. And remember that sometimes the simplest desserts are the ones that stay with you the longest. 16. Savory bread pudding. Bread pudding isn't always sweet. In the 1900s, it was just as often savory, made with stale bread, milk, onions, and sometimes a little cheese or leftover meat. You tear up day-old bread into chunks. You layer it in a baking dish with chopped onions, salt, and pepper. You pour milk and beaten eggs over the top. You dot it with butter, and you bake it until the top is golden and the inside is soft and custardy. Savory bread pudding was a way to use up stale bread, a way to stretch a meal, a way to feed a family when there wasn't much else in the pantry. And it worked. It was filling. It was warm. It was satisfying in a way that few other dishes could match. This is the kind of food that doesn't show up in fancy cookbooks, but it shows up in real kitchens, in real homes, where people are trying to make ends meet and put something good on the table at the same time. Savory bread pudding is a reminder that food doesn't have to be expensive to be good. It just has to be made with care, with intention, with love. The bread soaks up all the milk and eggs and becomes soft and custard-like. The onions add sweetness and depth. The butter creates little pockets of richness. And the whole thing bakes up into something that's part casserole, part comfort, part miracle. You can add whatever you have to this dish. Leftover ham, a handful of cheese, some herbs from the garden, and it all works. Try making it with leftover bread and whatever you have in the fridge. Onions, cheese, herbs, a little ham if you've got it, and taste what people ate when they refused to waste a single crumb. 17. Stuffed tomatoes with rice. Stuffed tomatoes with rice were elegant. They looked fancy, but they cost almost nothing, and they were served in homes all across America as a main dish or a hearty side. You cut the tops off large tomatoes. You scoop out the insides. You mix the tomato pulp with cooked rice, onions, breadcrumbs, and seasonings. You stuff that mixture back into the tomato shells. You place them in a baking dish, and you bake them until the tomatoes are soft and the tops are golden. This dish was popular in the summer when tomatoes were plentiful, when gardens were overflowing and families needed to use them up before they spoiled. And it was a beautiful way to do it. Stuffed tomatoes with rice are a celebration of the tomato, of its sweetness, its juiciness, its ability to hold flavor and become something more than just a vegetable. They are proof that simple ingredients, treated with respect, can create something memorable. This is garden cooking, farm cooking, home cooking at its best, and it's a shame more people don't make it anymore. The tomato becomes a natural bowl. Its juices flavor the rice filling. The whole thing bakes together into something that's both fresh and comforting. You can add herbs, a little cheese, some ground meat if you have it, but the basic version, with just rice and seasonings, is already perfect. The tomato skin holds everything together while it bakes, creating a self-contained little package of flavor. When August came and the vines were heavy with ripe tomatoes, this was how families made sure nothing went to waste. And every bite was a reminder that the simplest summer pleasures were often the most satisfying. Because when you bite into a baked tomato filled with seasoned rice, you taste summer. You taste sunshine. You taste the care of someone who didn't want to waste a single piece of what the earth gave them. 18. Apple pan dowdy. Apple pan dowdy is a mess, and that's the point. It's a rustic, broken-crusted, not-quite-pie dessert that was made in kitchens all across New England and beyond. You slice apples and toss them with sugar, cinnamon, and a little molasses or brown sugar. You put them in a baking dish. You cover them with pie crust, and then, halfway through baking, you break the crust. You push it down into the apples. You let the juices bubble up and soak into the broken pieces. The result is a dessert that's part pie, part cobbler, part something else entirely. The crust is soft and soaked with apple juice. The apples are sweet and spiced, and the whole thing is warm and messy and perfect. Apple pan dowdy was made because it was easier than pie. You didn't need a perfect crust. You didn't need perfect presentation. You just needed apples and dough and heat, and the willingness to break the rules. This dessert is a reminder that imperfection is okay, that messy can be beautiful, that sometimes the best things are the ones that don't try to be fancy. The molasses gives it a deep, dark sweetness that's different from regular apple pie. The broken crust creates all these little pockets where juice soaks in and gets caramelized, and when you scoop it into bowls, it's ugly and delicious and completely satisfying. Make apple pan dowdy this new year. Break the crust with confidence and serve it warm with a scoop of vanilla ice cream or a pour of heavy cream. And taste what it's like to stop worrying about perfection and just enjoy something good. But the next one's going to surprise you, because it takes corn and turns it into something you've probably never heard of. 19. Chowdered corn. Chowdered corn isn't creamy, not in the way you think. There's no cream, no milk, just corn, potatoes, onions, and water. And somehow it turns into something rich and thick and comforting. You scrape fresh corn off the cob, you dice potatoes and onions, you cook them together in water with a little butter, salt, and pepper. As the potatoes break down, they thicken the broth. The corn adds sweetness, and the whole thing becomes something that tastes like summer in a bowl. Chowdered corn was served in farmhouses and working-class homes. It was a way to use up fresh corn before it spoiled. A way to make a meal that was filling and flavorful without spending a dime on expensive ingredients. This is simple cooking, honest cooking, the kind of cooking that doesn't try to impress. It just tries to feed, to nourish, to comfort. And it works. The potatoes give the broth body without any dairy. The corn kernels burst with sweetness. The onions add depth, and the butter ties it all together. This was harvest food, late summer food, the kind of thing you made when the corn was coming in faster than you could eat it, and it was a way to make corn feel like more than just a side dish. It became soup. It became supper. It became a meal that could stand on its own. Families would eat it with thick slices of bread for soaking up the broth. The leftover cobs would be boiled to make the cooking water even sweeter and more flavorful, and children would help shuck the corn and scrape the kernels, their hands sticky with corn silk and summer heat. Try making chowdered corn with fresh corn and good potatoes. Let it simmer until the broth thickens and the flavors blend, and taste what people ate when they cooked with what the land gave them. 20. Boiled raisin dumplings. Boiled raisin dumplings sound old-fashioned, because they are, but they're also delicious. And they were a treat in homes where sugar was scarce and dessert was a luxury. You make a simple dough with flour, baking powder, a little sugar, and milk. You roll it out. You sprinkle raisins over it. You roll it up. You slice it into rounds. And then you drop those rounds into a pot of simmering sweet syrup made from sugar and water. You let them cook, covered, until they puff up and the dough cooks through. When you lift the lid, you've got soft, sweet dumplings soaked in syrup and studded with raisins. This was dessert for people who couldn't afford cake, who couldn't afford pie, who just wanted something sweet at the end of a hard day. And it delivered. Boiled raisin dumplings are warm, comforting. They taste like childhood, like a grandmother's kitchen, like a time when dessert didn't need to be fancy to be special. The dumplings steam in the syrup and become soft and pillowy. The raisins plump up and add little bursts of sweetness, and the syrup soaks into everything, making each bite rich and satisfying. This was the kind of dessert you made on the stove when you didn't have access to an oven, or when the oven was being used for something else. The steam from the pot would fill the kitchen with the smell of sugar and raisins. Kids would hover nearby, waiting for the lid to lift. And when it finally did, everyone got a bowl of something that tasted like love made simple. Make them on a cold night. Serve them in bowls with the syrup spooned over the top, and remember that sweetness doesn't come from complexity. It comes from care. 21. baked parsnips with molasses. Parsnips are forgotten now, but back in the 1900s, they were a staple. And when you bake them with molasses, they turn into something sweet and earthy and almost magical. You peel and slice parsnips, you lay them in a baking dish, you drizzle molasses over them, you dot them with butter, and you bake them until they're soft and caramelized. The molasses enhances the natural sweetness of the parsnips, the butter adds richness, and the heat turns everything into something that tastes like candy but feels like a vegetable. Baked parsnips with molasses were served as a side dish. But they could have been dessert. They're that sweet, that good, that surprising. This is root vegetable cooking at its best, and it's a reminder that vegetables don't have to be boring. They don't have to be steamed and plain. They can be rich, sweet, memorable. The parsnips caramelize around the edges. The molasses creates a dark, sticky glaze, and the butter helps everything meld together into something that's both earthy and sweet. This was winter food, root cellar food, the kind of thing you made when fresh vegetables were gone and you needed to make stored roots taste special. Parsnips were cheaper than carrots and stored better through the cold months. Families would keep them buried in sand in the cellar, pulling them out one by one as winter wore on. The molasses was often the only sweetener people could afford, dark and strong and lasting, and together parsnips and molasses created something that made even the hardest winter feel a little warmer. Try making baked parsnips with molasses this new year. Serve them alongside roasted meat or as a side for Sunday dinner, and watch people ask what you made, because they won't believe it's just parsnips. 22. Cottage cheese pie. Cottage cheese pie is the grandmother of modern cheesecake. It's lighter, simpler, less sweet, but just as satisfying. You mix cottage cheese with eggs, sugar, a little flour, and lemon zest. You pour it into a pie crust, and you bake it until it sets and the top turns golden. When it cools, you've got a pie that's creamy and tangy and just sweet enough. It's not as rich as cheesecake, but it's good, really good. And it was made in homes all across America when cottage cheese was cheaper than cream cheese. Cottage cheese pie was served at church suppers, family dinners, holiday meals. It was a way to make something special without spending a fortune. And it worked. This is simple baking, honest baking, the kind of baking that doesn't hide behind fancy ingredients or complicated techniques. It just relies on good flavors and a hot oven. The cottage cheese gives it a slightly grainy texture that's different from smooth cheesecake. The lemon zest adds brightness, and the whole thing is just sweet enough to be dessert without being cloying. Some families added raisins, some added a little vanilla. But the basic version is already perfect. The pie slices cleanly and holds its shape on the plate. It's refreshing in a way that heavy desserts aren't, and it proved that you didn't need expensive cream cheese or fancy techniques to make something that tasted like you cared. Make cottage cheese pie for your family. Serve it plain or with fresh berries, and taste what people ate when they wanted dessert but couldn't afford extravagance. Because sometimes simple is better. And speaking of simple, the next one is going to challenge everything you think you know about meatloaf. 23. Meatless loaf. Meatless loaf. No meat. Just nuts, bread, onions, and seasonings. And yet it was served as the main dish, as the centerpiece of the meal. And people ate it, and they liked it. You grind or chop nuts, walnuts, peanuts, whatever you have. You mix them with breadcrumbs, sautéed onions, eggs, and a little broth or milk. You season it with sage, salt, and pepper. You shape it into a loaf, and you bake it. When it comes out of the oven, it's firm, savory, hearty. It slices like meatloaf. It tastes like something substantial, and it proves that you don't need meat to make a satisfying main dish. Meatless loaf was popular with vegetarians, with people who couldn't afford meat, with families who were trying to stretch their food budget as far as it would go. And it worked. This is pre-modern vegetarian cooking, before fake meat. before processed substitutes. Just real ingredients, real flavors, real food. The nuts give it protein and richness. The breadcrumbs hold it together. The onions add sweetness and depth, and the sage makes it taste almost like Thanksgiving stuffing. You can serve this with gravy, with mashed potatoes, with all the same sides you'd serve with regular meatloaf. And it holds up. The texture is dense, but not heavy, with little bits of nut throughout that add interest to every bite. It browns beautifully in the oven, developing a crust that looks just like the real thing. Some families made this every Monday to use up Sunday's leftover bread, and by the time it hit the table, covered in brown gravy with a mountain of mashed potatoes on the side, nobody was thinking about what was missing. Try making meatless loaf this new year. Serve it with mashed potatoes and gravy, and see if you miss the meat. You might not. 24. Hot water gingerbread. Hot water gingerbread is different from regular gingerbread. The batter is made with boiling water, and that one change makes all the difference. You mix molasses, sugar, and boiling water. You add flour, ginger, cinnamon, baking soda. You stir it together. You pour it into a pan, and you bake it. The boiling water makes the batter thin, almost soupy, but when it bakes, it rises into something soft and moist and deeply spiced. It's not dry, it's not crumbly, it's perfect. Hot water. Gingerbread was made in farmhouses and working-class kitchens all across America. It was cheap, easy, and it filled the house with the smell of spice and molasses. This is the kind of cake you eat warm with butter, or with whipped cream, or just plain, and it's good every way. The boiling water activates the spices and makes them bloom. It creates steam that keeps the cake tender, and it dissolves the molasses so it spreads evenly throughout the batter. The result is a cake that's dark and fragrant and incredibly moist. It stays good for days, and it actually gets better as it sits. The texture is almost like a dense sponge, soaking up whatever you serve it with. Some families poured warm applesauce over it, others spread it thick with cream cheese, and kids would sneak pieces straight from the pan while it was still warm, the spices filling their noses and the molasses sticking to their fingers in the best possible way. Make hot water gingerbread this new year. Serve it to your family, and watch them go back for seconds, because some recipes don't need to be complicated to be unforgettable. 25. Onion and bread casserole. Onion and bread casserole sounds boring, but it's not. It's rich. It's savory. It's comforting in a way that few other dishes can match. You slice onions. You layer them in a baking dish with torn pieces of stale bread. You pour milk and beaten eggs over the top. You dot it with butter. You season it with salt and pepper, and you bake it until the top is golden and the inside is soft. The onions sweeten as they bake. The bread soaks up the milk and eggs. The butter adds richness, and the whole thing becomes something that tastes like home. Onion and bread casserole was served as a main dish, or a side, or whatever you needed it to be, because it was cheap, filling, and always good. This is the kind of food that doesn't get attention, but it should, because it's proof that simple ingredients, cooked with care, can create something worth remembering. The onions lose all their sharpness and become sweet and mild. The bread transforms into something custard-like. The top layer gets crispy while the bottom stays soft, and the whole thing is savory and satisfying and completely comforting. This was boarding house food, working-class food, the kind of thing you made when you had more mouths to feed than money to spend. Every boarding house cook knew this recipe by heart because it could feed 10 people for pennies. The smell of baking onions and butter would drift through the halls and bring everyone to the table. Some cooks added a little cheese if they had it, or fresh herbs from the garden, and everyone ate until they were full, because this was the kind of dish that stretched as far as you needed it to. 26. Rice and milk supper bowl. Rice and milk supper bowl is exactly what it sounds like. Rice cooked in milk, served in a bowl, eaten for supper. You cook rice in milk with a little butter and salt. You let it simmer until the rice is soft and the milk thickens. And then you serve it, hot, in bowls. Sometimes it was sweetened with sugar and cinnamon. Sometimes it was left savory with just salt and pepper. Either way, it was filling, comforting, and cheap. Rice and milk supper bowl was eaten in homes where meat was too expensive, where vegetables were out of season, where families needed something warm and filling to end the day. This is survival food, but it's also comfort food, because sometimes the simplest things are the most comforting. The rice absorbs the milk and becomes creamy. Each grain is tender and swollen, and the whole bowl is warm and soothing. Kids loved this because it was gentle and easy to eat. Parents loved it because it cost almost nothing and filled everyone up, and everyone slept well after a bowl of warm rice and milk. Some mothers would stir in a spoonful of jam for children who were feeling sick. Others would add a pat of butter that melted into golden pools on top. In winter, families ate it by the stove, the warmth of the bowl matching the warmth of the fire. In summer, some people let it cool and ate it like a pudding. And no matter the season, it was the kind of meal that said, "We don't have much, but we have enough." Try making rice and milk for supper. Sweeten it or leave it savory. Either way, it'll warm you from the inside out. But we're almost to the end, and the last few recipes are going to remind you why these dishes deserve to come back. 27. Mock mince filling. Mock mince filling. No meat. Just apples, raisins, spices, and a little molasses. And yet it tastes like traditional mincemeat pie filling. You chop apples and mix them with raisins, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and molasses. You cook it all down until it's thick and rich and dark, and then you use it to fill pies. Mock mince was made during the Depression, when real mincemeat, with its beef suet and organ meat, was too expensive. But people still wanted that spiced, rich holiday flavor, so they created this. And it worked. Mock mince filling tastes like Christmas, like tradition, like a recipe passed down through generations, and it proves that you don't always need the real thing to capture the feeling. The apples break down and become jam-like. The raisins plump up and add sweetness. The spices create that warm, festive flavor that makes you think of holidays, and the molasses ties it all together with a deep, dark richness. You can use this filling for pies, for turnovers, for cookies, and every time you do, you're tasting what people made when they refused to let poverty steal their traditions. Some families made big batches in the fall and stored it in jars for the winter holidays. The filling would keep for months, getting darker and richer as it aged. On Christmas morning, mothers would roll out pie dough and fill it with this spiced mixture, and the whole house would smell like celebration. Kids didn't know it wasn't real mincemeat, and they didn't care, because what mattered wasn't what was in the pie, but the fact that there was pie at all. 28. Fried bread with sugar. Fried bread with sugar is dessert at its simplest. You take slices of bread. You fry them in butter until they're golden and crispy. You sprinkle them with sugar, and you eat them hot. That's it. That's the whole recipe. But it tastes like childhood, like a treat made by a grandmother who didn't have much but gave everything she had. Fried bread with sugar was made in kitchens where dessert was a luxury, where sugar was precious, where families wanted something sweet but couldn't afford cake or pie. This is love in its simplest form: bread, butter, sugar, heat, and care. The bread gets crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. The butter adds richness. The sugar melts slightly and creates a sweet crust, and when you bite into it, it's warm and comforting and perfect. This was the kind of dessert you made for kids who were begging for something sweet. It took minutes, it cost pennies, and it made everyone happy. Mothers would stand at the stove, frying slice after slice, while children waited impatiently at the table. The smell of butter browning and sugar caramelizing would fill the whole house. Some families added a sprinkle of cinnamon mixed with the sugar for special occasions. Others kept it plain because plain was already perfect. The edges would get dark and candy-like while the center stayed soft and soaked with butter. Kids would eat it with their hands, licking the sugar off their fingers and asking for more. And mothers would smile and fry another round because making your children happy didn't require much when you knew how to turn nothing into something sweet. 29. Stewed rhubarb with dumplings. Stewed rhubarb with dumplings is springtime on a plate. Tart rhubarb cooked with sugar until it softens, topped with fluffy dumplings that steam in the rhubarb juices. This was supper, not dessert, supper. Because when the first rhubarb came up in the garden, families wanted to celebrate, and this was how they did it. Stewed rhubarb with dumplings is a reminder that food is seasonal, that ingredients have their moment, and that sometimes the best meals are the ones that honor that. The rhubarb breaks down into a pink, tangy sauce. The dumplings steam on top and become soft and pillowy, and when you scoop it all into bowls, you get tart fruit and fluffy dough and pure comfort. This was early spring food, made when people were tired of winter storage vegetables and desperate for something fresh. Rhubarb was one of the first things to come up in the garden, and families treated it like treasure. After months of eating from jars and root cellars, that first stalk of rhubarb meant winter was finally over. Children would run to the garden to check if it was ready yet, waiting for those red-pink stalks to push up through the soil. Mothers would cut the stalks carefully, leaving enough so the plant would keep producing. The rhubarb would go straight into the pot with sugar and a little water, cooking down into something tart and sweet at the same time. Then the dumpling dough would be dropped on top in big spoonfuls, and the lid would go on so they could steam. The whole house would smell like spring and sugar and hope. When the dumplings were done, fluffy and cooked through, everyone would gather around the table for a meal that said, "We made it through another winter." And that was worth celebrating. 30. Custard toast. And finally, custard toast. Bread soaked in sweetened egg custard and baked until golden and puffy. It's not French toast. It's softer, richer, more delicate, and it was served as dessert, or breakfast, or a sweet snack. Custard toast is the last recipe on this list, but it's not the least. It's a reminder that even at the end, there's still sweetness, still comfort, still something worth savoring. The bread soaks up the custard mixture. It puffs up in the oven. It turns golden on top. And when you cut into it, it's soft and custardy inside with a slightly crisp exterior. This was what you made when you had eggs and milk and bread and wanted to turn them into something special, something that felt like a treat, something that ended the meal, or the day, on a sweet note. You'd layer slices of bread in a buttered baking dish, overlapping them slightly like shingles on a roof. Then you'd whisk together eggs, milk, sugar, and vanilla, and pour it all over the bread, making sure every piece was soaked through. Some cooks would let it sit for a few minutes so the bread could really absorb the custard. Others would pop it straight into the oven, eager to get it on the table. As it baked, the top would turn golden and slightly crispy, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. You could dust it with powdered sugar or drizzle it with a little cream. And when you served it, warm from the oven, it was the kind of thing that made people sigh with contentment. Because custard toast wasn't trying to be anything more than what it was. Simple ingredients transformed by heat and care into something that made life a little sweeter. 30 recipes, 30 pieces of history, 30 reminders that the people who came before us knew how to make something out of nothing. They knew how to turn scraps into feasts. They knew how to cook with hope, even when hope was hard to find. These recipes aren't gone, they're just forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to bring them back. Not because we have to, but because we want to. Because there's something beautiful about cooking the way our grandparents did, about honoring the past, about carrying these traditions into the new year. So try one, try all of them. Make mock chicken legs on a Sunday. Bake a mock apple pie for dessert. Stew some rhubarb with dumplings in the spring. And remember that the best recipes aren't always the fanciest ones. Sometimes they're the ones that remind us where we came from. These dishes weren't created by famous chefs or written down in expensive cookbooks. They were made by ordinary people in ordinary kitchens who refused to give up, who looked at what little they had and said, "I can make this work." And they did, every single time. When you cook these recipes, you're not just making food. You're connecting with generations of people who came before you, people who faced harder times than most of us will ever know, people who still found a way to feed their families with dignity and love. These recipes are proof that creativity doesn't come from abundance. It comes from necessity, from the determination to make today better than yesterday, even if all you have is flour and lard and a hot stove. So, as we step into 2026, maybe we take a little of that spirit with us. Maybe we remember that the best meals aren't always the most expensive ones. And maybe, just maybe, we cook something that our great-grandmothers would recognize. Something that would make them smile and nod and say, "Yes, that's exactly right." Happy New Year and happy cooking.